I want to add to what Charles and Starr talked about with just a quick series of observations about what Katrina tells us about poverty. With all due respect and admiration for Charles, I would say that even if the underclass itself, under that terminology, was not discussed very much during the 90s, that nevertheless the idea that Katrina revealed a secret of, in particular, entrenched black poverty, I think is rather absurd in that, for example, the Rodney King riots certainly occasioned a major conversation about what was going on the bottom in particular communities. And then, of course, there was welfare reform in 1996. And for those who follow these sorts of things, I think that definitely occasioned a certain amount of attention to the poor, and particularly the brown poor. And so when the headline started that Katrina had revealed something, as if this was a uniquely heartless country, you know, where we see things through the eyes of Marie Antoinette and just don't know that they are all of these poor people, that doesn't represent the America that I feel like I've been in as a mature person. Nevertheless, when people say that a secret is revealed, I think what many of them really mean, especially those on the left, are that there is something that the government hasn't done that any idiot could see needs to be done, and that the absence of that thing is due to some sort of moral insensitivity on the part of the powers that be. That there's something just and rather obvious, rather simple, that hasn't been done, and that finally these images on the internet and on TV ought reveal it. And I remember when all of this unfolded, and because now we've got not only the internet but high-speed internet, you can follow the development of something blow by blow by blow. And I remember the first time, it's easy to forget that for about the first 10 minutes of Katrina, it was just about New Orleans and how lots of people were being hurt. Then it started trickling in the blogs, people saying, have you noticed how many of those faces that we're seeing on the screen are black? And I thought, oh no. And I knew what I was going to be doing on the radio and on TV for the next year. Because I thought, we're going to have Michael Eric Dyson and Cornel West and the usual people saying that what we see on these screens is due to the fact that certain things haven't happened for poor black America. And that's exactly what's happened. And the fact is that I think the lesson of what we see on those screens is a very strong one, but it's not what we've been told. So, for example, the idea is that all of the people in question were so poor because factory jobs had moved away, low-skilled jobs had moved away. Now, that's just considered a dogma. It's taught in schools. It's what you read on the New York Times op-ed page. That is considered a valid point. It is false. For example, it's never discussed that, okay, maybe there isn't a Ford plant. But on the other hand, with the same lack of education, one can be a repairman. One can be, for example, a mechanic. One can be a security guard. I have never seen a single argument, and maybe there is one, but I've never seen a single argument that the low-skilled jobs that are available in today's America are in significantly lower number than the ones in grand old hat-wearing America where that job was a factory. No one's ever presented it as if those jobs don't exist. There's a whole literature about that, which, and I'm only going to plug my latest book once, it's called Winning the Race. I discuss this in detail. Important to realize I'm speaking orally. I don't speak in footnotes. The actual argument is very systematic and comprehensive. The factory argument is absurd. Yet, that is what we were expected to think. Or, the idea is that the problem for the people who were on the screens was that housing project buildings are too tall and they're too far removed from the street. Now, that's a problematic argument as well. And, Nicole, you might correct me on this one, but generally housing projects in New Orleans aren't very tall. Yeah. And so the whole, is that true?
4 stories.
Right, and so the whole tall building argument doesn't apply to that particular city. And there are many others. The one other one I'll mention is that supposedly what went wrong in the lower Ninth Ward is that when the schools were forcibly desegregated, whites and also middle-class blacks left, and therefore you had a high concentration of poor black people. So there's another wisdom that when you have too many poor and black people living in one place, then all havoc must break loose. This, again, is assumed among good-thinking people. It is taught in universities, the idea that segregation means poverty, etc. But the fact is that it only ever seems to be adduced when it comes to the fate of the descendants of black slaves in the United States at a certain point in the 20th century. In terms of actual humanity, again, there's so many counterexamples. Chinatowns. Chinatowns, before they were theme parks, were where very, very poor Chinese people were clustered together because they had to be there. They didn't want to be there. And in, for example, San Francisco, if you stepped outside of that Chinatown, which was about 16 square blocks, somebody beat you up. You had to live there. And it was not a matter of just restaurants. It was a festering, filthy, hideous ghetto, and on top of that, most of the people were men. Now, there was crime in the Chinatowns. Nothing like the sort of thing that we're now dealing with in New Orleans or, by extension, Houston. Nothing like it. And what that shows is not that there's something good about Chinese people versus black people, but it shows that the argument that when you segregate a bunch of poor people who are all of the same ethnicity, then what can you expect is, again, false. The argument just fails when you look at all the evidence. So, back to the TV screens. What were we seeing? And somehow, among people smarter than me, it is considered useless to consider that there was another factor in modern black history that may have had a little something to do with what we saw. And that is that welfare policies were vastly changed in the late 1960s, specifically, particularly in 1966. This is something which I first got wind of from Charles's book, Losing Ground, and the point is thoroughly demonstrable in all sorts of ways. And this is something which I think had a seismic effect upon black history. Read history books, no one ever talks about it. The only reason I can think of, and I think this really is the reason as to why this gets left out, is because I was born in 65, so I was too young to know. But I imagine even if you were a mature person from 66 to 1970, given all the things that were going on, I doubt if incremental changes in the welfare laws were what tended to grab most people. Each change must not have seemed very important. The press wasn't as focused on black poverty at the time. Nevertheless, you look in the microfilms now and you see very important things happening. And so, for example, only welfare reform had taken care of the problem in 1996, but by then a certain amount of damage had been done. So, for example, if you look at New Orleans in particular, in 1960, I'm about to turn 41, and I'm noticing that my memory is not as quick as it used to be. I don't have the figures stuck in my head because I just looked at this 4 weeks ago. Yeah, that's what I keep hearing. I do remember this, and this is true. I don't remember the numbers. The number of people living on welfare in New Orleans in 1960 was 2/5 the number by just 1970. So it went up that much. It more than doubled. I forget, the numbers are in the upper tens of thousands. That's a lot. It had never happened in any other decade, and the economy, as poor blacks went, was actually getting better in the late 60s. So it wasn't out of any desperation. It was foisted upon particularly poor black people very deliberately by people who, when they're living today, are unapologetic for the fact and admit it openly. This was very, very important. And so, this is something that was only changed in 1996, but it had wreaked havoc on these communities. It made it easy for a man not to take care of his kids. It made it easy for a woman to never work again. It broke down communities in a way that nothing could have before, even the racism that we all know was there. So, in 1990, and this figure I do remember because I've actually looked at it more often, the figure of families on welfare was 27,900 and something. By 2002, the figure was 6,900 and something, so about 7,000. So it was only a quarter. It was a small number, really, as these things go, of families. Nevertheless, it had only been 9 years since welfare reform when we saw those things on those screens. And so what we were seeing was the result of 1966 to 1996, which brought out the very worst in poor black human beings, teaching people not to work for a living, teaching people to have children with multiple people. And as Starr has artfully described in her book Uncle Sam's Plantation, these were things that very few innocent people could have resisted. It was giving a